I think it's time for us to get started. I want to thank you all for coming out. I'm Blair Rubel. I'm Director of Comparative Urban Studies here at the Wilson Center. And I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of Jane Harmon, the Wilson Center's President and CEO. She apologizes for not being here. She is on the West Coast this morning, and as much as bicoastal people would like to actually be bicoastal, she obviously can't be in two places at once. Last winter, I wandered into the Strand bookstore in Manhattan. I think probably most of you know the Strand. And I was checking out the new books, and I saw The Spirit of Cities being put out in the stack of new books. And I couldn't resist picking it up, given my own intellectual interests. And I was sort of looking at it. And then I got to the dedication to city Zens. And I knew this was a book that I would have to buy, and I did. And it proved to be good company on the Acela ride down to DC, such good company that I immediately the next morning sent an email to Daniel Bell telling him what a wonderful book he had written with his Israeli colleague, Avner de Shalit. As most of you know, and some of this is in the bios we handed out, Daniel teaches ethics and political philosophy at Tsinghua University in Beijing. He is also professor of arts and humanities at Shanghai Jiaotong University. He was educated at McGill and Oxford and has taught in Singapore and Hong Kong and has held research fellowships at Princeton University Center for Human Values and Stanford Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences. But when I read the book, I recognized something else about Daniel's writings. He is a Montrealer of a particular generation, the generation that came of age during Quebec's intense battles over sovereignty. Now, Montreal has nurtured any number of great minds, Charles Taylor, Leonard Cohen, André Laurendeau, Gabriel Rai, Anne Charny, the central protagonists of the great battles of the 20th century over sovereignty and federalism, René Lévesque, Pierre Elliott Trudeau. If there are any Quebecers in the room, I will toss in an incendiary bomb and add Mordecai Rickler to the list. But Daniel and his generation really faced a different challenge than the people I just named. They were living in a city in which identity was questioned at every moment, in every place, in every activity. And they were forced to consider the meaning of community, ethnicity, religion, the place of a city in society, of citizenship. And I think that a very particular sensitivity to these questions emerged among intellectuals, and not just intellectuals, just people who grew up in Montreal at that time. And you see it in the literature written by Trevor Ferguson or Lease from Bleh. You see it in the work of perhaps the best specialist on identity in Russia and Ukraine, Dominique, who's at the University of Ottawa. And I immediately spotted this distinctive spirit in The Spirit of Cities. And it's a book about identity. And of course, the questions which growing up in Montreal posed at that time were all questions of identity. Now, I dwelled on this background piece of information about Daniel because you all probably know the rest. And you probably have seen his New York Times op-ed not too long ago on the possibility of a Confucian constitution for China, a very modest proposal. But I wanted to underscore the importance of a kind of intellectual trajectory in getting Daniel to where he is in this book. Georgetown President John DeGioia is obviously well known to many of you. I think there are several faculty members here from Georgetown. He's a graduate of the university's English department. He earned a PhD in philosophy. He joined the Georgetown faculty in the Department of Philosophy. And I think the titles of some of his courses suggest why he's an excellent commentator for this particular session. Ethics and Global Development, Ways of Knowing, Human Rights, a Culture in Crisis. He's long thought about the nature of the university, of the Catholic university, of the Jesuit university, of the university in society and in the city. And indeed, during his presidency at Georgetown, he's been very active in ensuring that Georgetown is a good citizen of this city. He's also been very successful. He just raised, he's in the middle of a $1.5 billion capital campaign, and they've already raised, I guess, $1 billion. And that made me think that probably when you were an English major, your friends would say, what are you ever going to do with it?
It wasn't just my friends.
Yeah. So, but there's actually an important point behind that joke. We live in a city in which the new key word is relevance. And there's an assumption that an English major or philosophy major or history major leads in a pathway to irrelevance. But I think the work of you're about to hear from both people strongly underscores the importance of critically trained minds in the humanities for understanding the world that we live in. And finally, in preparing these remarks, I was taken back to a graduate seminar I had in the 1970s, University of Toronto. It was taught by Alan Bloom, whom some of you may know from his book, The Closing of the American Mind. And the class revolved around a close reading of Plato's Laws and Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian Wars. And the title of the course was Modern Political Thought. And I think you'll hear now from Daniel for the next half hour or so, and then from President DeGioia for another 15 minutes before we open it up. You'll hear why training in the humanities, the kinds of mind that suggests that a close reading of Plato really does qualify as modern political thought, why these perspectives are important. Daniel?
Well, thank you so much, Blair, and for inviting me, and thanks to Lauren also for helping to organize this. And of course, thanks also to President DeGioia for agreeing to discuss this important topic. I should say that last time I met President DeGioia was at the annual meeting in Davos in February. And there, we tend to think that Davos, people are very cosmopolitan, beyond nationality. I mean, that term was invented by Samuel Huntington, and it was meant to be pejorative. But it turns out that when you talk to people, they're not, maybe they're not that nationalistic, but it doesn't follow that they're cosmopolitan and rootless. In fact, quite the opposite. I mean, at the dinner where we were, there were two South Africans, one from Johannesburg and one from Cape Town, who were fiercely arguing about which city is better. I mean, a very strong sense of urban pride. So I think even in this sort of, worldly, community and so on, that you do have a strong need for community. And I think a city is a good place for that sense of community to be instantiated. I mean, I'll develop that theme a little bit. I wasn't going to say much about Washington. I think Blair here has a wonderful book, which is actually more scholarly, than my book, and it's called Creating Diversity Capital. And he has excellent chapters on Montreal, Kiev, and Washington. And to be frank, I mean, as a Montrealer, there's a bit of a sensitive area. I mean, for one thing, the War of 1812 is the 200th anniversary. It's a big thing in Canada. On the July 1st Canadian National Day, we're all taking pride of we repelled the Americans from Washington. They tried to invade in Montreal, but we repelled them. And then, they didn't talk about burning the White House a couple of years later. And I apologize for that. But then, more importantly for me, is I was a big baseball fan. I loved the Montreal Expos, and they moved here, as you probably know, to become the Washington Nationals. But when I read Blair's book, this was a very important. He says for the first time in memory, a major public policy discussion, namely about whether to build a stadium and how much and so on, politics transcended racial boundaries, at least insofar as city politicians were concerned. So this debate over baseball played a very important role in the shift, Blair argues, from a civil rights municipal regime to a more pragmatic municipal regime. So, okay, we lost the Expos, but if it helped to, let's say, improve, let's say, the civic life of Washington, then I think it's a good
Well,
thing.
that may have been transitory, but
Oh, really? Okay. Well, anyway, I'll support the Washington Nationals. Okay, so what about this city idea? I mean, on the one hand, it sounds a bit peculiar because there's not that much written about this, actually. Political theorists tend to argue about whether we should be the importance of nationality or whether we should care more about global justice, but there's not that much thinking about cities from an ethical and political viewpoint. There's some, but not a lot. But when you think about it in terms of our, emotions, I mean, I think cities play a much more important life. I mean, I was just in New York, and you meet people from New York, so I'm from New York, I'm not American. They're so proud to be New York, and we know the slogan, I love New York. It's probably the most famous slogan in history, because you see that slogan now all over the world, including Beijing. You see, I love Beijing. In Shanghai, you see, I love Shanghai. And it taps real emotions. I mean, of course, it's manipulated by the market. If you go to the I Love Toronto website, it's actually a real estate company that's trying to sell you houses. But it does tap real emotions, and yet there's no word to express that. When it comes to Chinese, it's a beautiful language, but sometimes you have to invent new words to express deep feelings and so on, and especially if they're from other cultures. But it's rare in English that it comes, hold on a second, everybody talks about I love my city, but yet what word do we use to express that? For nation, we have nationalism or patriotism. So we literally had to invent a new word, and we call it civicism, this idea that we love our cities. And we had a similar problem in Chinese when we tried to, when we were thinking about the translation, and we had to also invent, it doesn't sound very nice in Chinese, but ai cheng zhui, it's literally, I loving cities is the closest we could come to thinking about how to express this idea in language. Now, this idea of civicism, the love that we have of city, it tends to be most intense when cities express a particular identity. I mean, just think about it in your, you might love your neighborhood, but you're not going to love your neighborhood McDonald's that much, right? You love the aspects of your neighborhood, the parts that are more distinctive. So I think the civicism tends to be strongest when cities affirm a particular identity, or we can call it spirit, or what we call in the book, an ethos of a city. And really by that we just mean the dominant social and political values or sentiments of a city. I mean, it's a pretty vague definition, but I think the cities with the strongest ethos express the strongest forms of urban pride typically. And the 9 cities that we cover in this book tend to have a pretty strong both a pretty strong civic pride or civicism, as well as a pretty distinctive ethos, or so we tried to argue in that book. Now, by an ethos, we don't mean that people agree upon values. I mean, to a certain extent, it's more like what they argue about. In Montreal, people tend to argue about language. I mean, if you go to Beijing, the taxi drivers love to argue about politics, national politics. If you go to Shanghai, they don't do that. In Jerusalem, it's about religion and so on. It's more about what are the common themes, so to speak, that people argue about, and that shape the people's life, whether they like it or not. Okay, now the idea that cities have an ethos, I mean, on the one hand, it's very old-fashioned, as Blair suggests. I mean, it goes back to at least in Western political thought, it goes back to the ancient Greeks, right? I mean, Athens had a very strong ethos as a kind of taking pride in democracy, and so did Sparta, and that inspired great political theorizing, right? Plato and Aristotle, they both, by comparing Athens and Sparta and other city-states, that really gave them great ideas for political theorizing. In China, perhaps the greatest period for social and political thought was the Warring States period, and also then the walled cities had a very strong identity. Yes, they had commonalities, but they had differences too. And the greatest thinkers of the day, Confucius and Mencius and others, they roamed from place to place, and that also gave them ideas for social and political theorizing. Now, today, cities, of course, are much bigger and diverse, right? I mean, Beijing and Shanghai, I teach in both places. They both have over 20 million people. But yet, they're very different and very strong sense of identity and of difference. I mean, if anybody knows you speak to Beijing people about Shanghai, they're going to start bashing the city. Same thing in Shanghai. You speak to them about Beijing, everything's, it's the opposite viewpoint. There's a very strong sense of identity and difference, even in large cities like Beijing and Shanghai. Now you might say, well, it's still a bit vague. I mean, exactly how to identify an ethos? Well, we think that there are at least 2 ways, more social scientific methods as well as more quantitative methods. And the social scientific ones, obviously one would be value surveys, right? You just ask people what are the sorts of things that you care about and that express the identity of your city. And in China, you have more and more of this, because China, the cities, superficially are very homogeneous. At least from the architectural point of view, it was the last 60 years have been pretty disastrous. You had, 30 years of Soviet-style modernization followed by 30 years of American style. And in some sense, it's the worst of both worlds. So now there's a very strong sense to identify, what is the spirit of cities. This is more recent, actually. Beijing, you have these debates. You have it in Harbin, in Changsha, these huge cities. And partly how they do that is by asking the people, tell us about the dominant values of your cities. That's one way of doing it. Now, in the book, we couldn't have that because most of the national survey data tends to be nation-based. What are the dominant values in Canada versus U.S.? There hasn't been much about cities until recently. The one chapter where we do have a lot of survey data is Singapore, because obviously Singapore is both a city and a state, and thus we have a lot of information about what people think in Singapore. Another way is by looking at the distribution of resources in city budgets. In Montreal, a large portion will go to the protection of language. Obviously, that's important to Montreal. In a city like Chengdu in China, they take great pride in a city that promotes equity between rural and urban areas, and 30% of the budget goes to rural development, more than other Chinese cities. You can look at that. It's quantitative data. You can also do archival research. Look at what some of the great city planners had in mind when they designed a city. Baron Haussmann in Paris. He had great ideas, and he wrote them down. You look at that, and that gives you some insight too. But we can also use what we can call qualitative methods. And one thing here is, for example, you can interview people of different social classes and religions and ethnic groups and see what they have in common. That's one way of getting at a kind of common ethos. And we did that in the book to a certain extent. But you can also rely on personal experience. I lived in Montreal for 22 years. I can write about it, drawing upon my personal experience. Of course, it's limited, but it's helpful to a certain extent. But cities that you don't know so well from personal experience, of course, my friend writes about Jerusalem, because that's where he's from and he teaches there and so on. But we also rely on another method, which we call strolling. And this is the idea that you do tons of reading before you visit a city, right? You read about the history, about its current situation, so on, and you develop certain tentative hypotheses. And then by some sort of random strolling and encounters, you try to challenge and refine those hypotheses. And we did that for cities like Berlin and Paris in the book. And of course, that was the most fun. And I confess, people say, you got grants for just walking around cities. And but it does lead to some useful results. Okay, why is affirming an ethos a good thing? This is a more normative question. And here I'm going to say at least 5 reasons for why we should care about this topic. And the first reason is I alluded to already in the case of Chinese cities, is the worry that with capitalism and with development, that things tend to become more homogenized. Things look the same and feel the same. There's consumerist culture takes over, and there's a flattening of difference and diversity that makes social life so valuable. But of course, globalization also has a good side. It promotes openness and tolerance and so on. Who's against that, right? At least among most, let's say, educated people. So the question is, how can we promote the good side of globalization while minimizing this bad side? In other words, how can we promote openness and tolerance while also promoting a kind of cultural particularity? And we think it's better to do that at the level of cities than at the level of states. When states go on to say, wow, this is Canadian values or this is American values, this is too big and diverse, and also tends to marginalize minorities, and it could even take dangerous forms, both against minorities and against external enemies. But when cities do it, it tends to be not so dangerous. Of course, cities don't have armies, and at a certain extent, it's not so problematic. So we think that one way of affirming cultural particularity in the modern world, given that urbanization is a trend that's not going to be stopped, including China now, over half live in cities, it's very important to affirm that cultural particularity at the level of cities more than at the level of countries. We have sayings in English, right? When in Rome, do as the Romans do. To a certain extent, this is the idea that, you should respect the cultural particularity of a city, and of course, so long as it respects basic human rights. I mean, we're not going to say that you should respect the ethos of Berlin in World War II, which was founded on racism and anti-Semitism, right? But once a city let's say, secures very basic human rights, then I think we have a certain obligation to respect the ethos of the city. Okay, why else should we care about the ethoses of cities? Well, the second reason, we can call it curbing the excesses of nationalism. You know, my friend is an Israeli, of course, and, you know, he's pretty much left and progressive and so on, and he worries about the excesses of nationalism in Israel. You know, even, and I'm from Canada, you know, and China, people also worry about nationalism. You know, in Canada, as mentioned, the July 1st celebrations about the 1812 war, I mean, that seemed to be a bit over the top. Even Canada, you know, which you don't tend to think can express these dangerous forms of nationalism, but you know, it is a bit worrisome. But yet we can't avoid this need to be rooted, this need for communal attachment, you know. Even in Davos, like I just mentioned, most people have this need for community, this need for identity, and where's it going to be attached? That's the big problem. Well, I mean, that's a big issue. And we think that cities are a very important source of attachment and less dangerous than attachments to countries. Now, we're not against nationalisms, you know, soft forms of nationalism and so on. It can be very useful. You know, for example, in China, if people are attached to China, then they'll be more willing to redistribute resources from the poor, you know, that's from the rich kind of eastern areas to the poor western areas. That's fine, that's important. But here I can invoke a Confucian idea of graded love. You know, this is the view that our responsibilities are most intense among our intimates. You know, for example, my family, I owe more to them. First of all, because they're the source of my happiness, main source of my happiness, and secondly, because of reciprocal obligations. You know, my parents did stuff for me, so I should do stuff for them in return. But we should extend that love from intimate ties. But the more we extend, the further we go, the less the ties and the less the responsibilities. That's the idea of graded love, that we have kind of circles of sympathy. Actually, Adam Smith had a roughly similar idea. And the further you go from intimate ties, the less intense the ties and the fewer the responsibilities. So think about this. Given that we spend most of more interaction with citizens, you know, with people from cities and with people with countries, it follows that we should have strongest ties to people in our cities than to people in our countries. But of course, we should still have special ties to people in our countries, but maybe not as intense as ties to people in our cities. And also, to be frank, I mean, cities are often more open to outsiders' attachments, you know? Like, in my case, you know, I've been in Beijing 8 years, and people would say, oh, you know, Lao Beijing, I'm an old Beijinger. But they wouldn't say that, they wouldn't say, like, you're Chinese now. The best that I could hope for is 中国女婿, which is Chinese son-in-law, because I'm married to a Chinese. But cities, they allow for like full identification from foreigners. And I think that's another reason to say that this need for identity should be expressed more at the level of cities than at the level of countries. Okay, also we can have more than 2 or 3 attachments. You know, I can love Montreal and Beijing, no big deal, right? But if I say that I'm patriotic Canadian and patriotic Chinese, it sounds a bit odd, you know? Anyway, we can argue about that. Okay, third reason why it's important for cities to have an ethos is that cities can do things, socially and politically valuable things, that states cannot do often. Actually, Benjamin Barber, the political theorist, is coming out with a book called If Mayors Rule the World, which is going to argue this point. And basically the point here is that there are many things that states find it very hard to do. Like, we're going to wait a long time, I regret, you know, to say for China and the US to agree upon serious per capita emissions cuts, you know. But cities in both countries can do a lot, and they are doing a lot. You know, in China, you know, cities like Hangzhou, you know, and Baoding are doing a lot in terms of environmental sustainability. In the US, you have cities like San Francisco and Portland that are doing a lot. They can establish ties with other cities, like sister cities, and you can have these kind of solidarity among cities that almost have their own foreign policy to do things that states can do. That's another very important reason, I think, to allow for this idea that cities can affirm a strong ethos, and then they could link with other cities that affirm their ethos to do things that states can do. And I think environmental sustainability is a clear case. Another reason, a fourth reason, is that a strong ethos also can help to develop the economy. And I think, in China, as mentioned, I think that we think that first obligation is to protect basic human rights, but we include that, by basic human rights, we include basic levels of material subsistence. That people have to reach a certain level where they don't have to be hungry or worried about, death, and after that we can worry about an ethos. But having an ethos can help to overcome material scarcity and poverty. And there's some clear cases of that, like Qufu, which is basically, the home of Confucian culture in China. It used to be a very poor city, but now it began to promote its Confucian aspect, attracts tons of cultural tourists, and helps to develop the economy. Now, some of my Confucian friends say, oh, this is bad, it's commercialization of Confucian and so on, but, if it helps to overcome poverty, then, maybe we should allow for it, and we even say that it's a good thing. Fifth reason, and maybe this is a more kind of esoteric reason, I think it was mentioned already actually by Blair just now, that cities can also inspire social and political theorizing. As mentioned, Plato and Aristotle, John Locke, he wrote his famous letter of tolerance. Why? A very important reason is that he was in Amsterdam, which in the 17th century was the most tolerant city in the world, and Blair already mentioned Montreal and Charles Taylor and multiculturalism. If Charles Taylor was from, Toronto? No, that's not a good example. I don't know, Winnipeg, he probably wouldn't have come up with his theories.
We'll continue that discussion.
Okay, finally, let me just say a little bit of what are some of the political or policy implications. And basically, our view is that once a city has overcome material scarcity and basic human rights, then it can and should promote an ethos. I already mentioned Toronto. Actually, they do worry about not having an ethos. And I have a friend who's actually a paid consultant to work on what he calls a DNA of Toronto. And he develops this idea that some sort of intercultural ethos. That in Toronto, most people have at least 2 identities and sometimes 3, and they can navigate between those different identities. Anyway, so how do you do that? Well, one point is that I think it's very important for cities not to have a big gap between rich and poor, because if they do, then it's very hard to have a common ethos, right? I mentioned Cape Town already. If those of you have been, it's very beautiful, but there's a huge gap between rich and poor, and it's hard for such cities to develop a common ethos. So I think if we agree that developing a common ethos is important, then it's also important to reduce the gap between rich and poor. It also helps to have a long-term rivalry with another city. My friend is from Israel. You speak to people from Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, and also very strong rivalry. Shanghai and Beijing, Montreal and Toronto. If you have this rivalry, cities don't have armies. It can take almost fun forms, sometimes expressed in sporting events and so on. But it helps to maintain this identity, to have some sort of rivalry with another city. Even being threatened by an outside force is not necessarily a bad thing. The fact that Montreal views itself as this kind of, oasis of French surrounded by a sea of English, it gives a very strong motivation to maintain its French character. Or Hong Kong, they actually take pride in their capitalist ethos, as opposed to what? As opposed to what used to be communist China. That sort of gives those cities a strong, motivation to maintain their ethos. I think it's also important for cities to have political authorities to enact laws and bylaws. And I think Blair discusses this in the case of Washington. It's not always a good thing for cities to have a lot of authority, but at least it's a kind of necessary condition for cities to develop some sort of ethos. And actually, the cities in China have a lot more legislative authority than the cities in the U.S., which is interesting. People tend to think of China as highly centralized, but not necessarily in this case. Also helps to have great city planners. In this book, we look at 3. We look at Baron Haussmann in Paris, Go King Sui in Singapore, and Robert Moses, for better or worse, in the case of New York. They had certain ideas, and certainly they helped to set their stamp on cities. Finally, it helps to have some sort of external agency to promote the city, whether it's I Love New York or what. Of course, that's not going to work if there's no kind of basis there, You can have, you can promote, and you can have an advertising agency that's going to have a slogan like, I love Cleveland, or Cleveland is a romantic city, but it's just, maybe this is the wrong example again. Sorry. Actually, people used to make, I haven't been to Cleveland, I've been to Buffalo, people used to make fun of Buffalo, but now I really love the Buffalonians. Anyway, one quick, how much time do I have?
5 minutes.
Okay, I'll just show a few photos since I won't go through the rest. Of course, people say ethos are not fixed in time. You have to look at the historical development of cities, and that's what we do for the 9 cities in the book. And ethoses can change. And sometimes even one building can help to shape a brand new ethos. And you may know this is the famous museum, Frank Gehry Museum in Bilbao, which really transformed the city from the kind of declining industrial city into a kind of mecca of art. So it's a really interesting case. Well, this is Jerusalem, of course, and there's this thing called the Jerusalem syndrome of tourists who go to Jerusalem and experience a kind of epiphany, and sometimes they literally end up in mental hospitals. I'm not saying that she's that way, but that's also one way of looking at the extremes of ethoses of cities. This is the Montreal scene here, and you have, it's interesting, you have the little flag there, Quebec flag, but you have in English, Go Habs means Go Montreal Canadiens. They're very proud of being Montreal Canadiens fans, but also it's expressed in a kind of, being proud francophones, and yet they write it in English too. This is the used to be the tallest building in Southeast Asia. It's a hotel now in Singapore. And Singapore, of course, is both a country and a state, so they're really it's a bit too late now in many ways, but it's better late than never. They're going out of their way to preserve some of the old buildings that express their historical heritage. I mean, to a certain extent, ethoses have to be built upon history, and to a certain extent, that has to be expressed in its architectural heritage. Now, this is, for the ethos of Hong Kong, we describe it as materialism without hedonism. It's these slogans, but you have to look at the chapter to make sense of them. But basically, Hong Kong takes pride, to a certain extent, in its capitalist ethos, and it's expressed architecturally here. I mean, this small building is the Legislative Council, the political building, but it's dwarfed by the huge Bank of China and the other financial buildings. In Beijing, going to be the opposite, right? Around the Second Ring Road, no building can be higher than the political buildings. This is a new opera house in Beijing, and there's a big dispute over whether you should have this opera house in a kind of next to all the political buildings, including, taxi drivers very critical of Chinese politics, but yet they objected to this, because they thought that it interfered with the political character of the city, at least of the center of the city. But actually, there's a lot in Confucianism about how politics is, about how music is important, has political significance. So I think that's one way of making sense of that, although I doubt that they had that in mind when they built that. But anyway. Well, this is Oxford, of course, a city of learning. And certain sports that are more appropriate for that ethos is slow-moving cricket. There's a long literature, long history of literature about cricket and so on. I played ice hockey in Oxford, and it didn't really fit very well into the ethos, I confess. In fact, when we played the Oxford City people, they're out to really bash our skulls. But anyway. So this is Berlin, the new parliament. Transparency. It's meant to reflect the ethos of tolerance and transparency. And in the book, we argue that Berlin, you look at the history, that it swings between extremes of tolerance and intolerance. Under Frederick the Great, the most tolerant city in Europe, and in World War II, the least tolerant. And now again, it's known as the most tolerant city of Europe, and it's expressed architecturally in this. Now, my friend is Israeli, and he had family reasons to ask about, can it swing back into its extreme of intolerance? And strangely enough, we had some fairly pessimistic answers. Okay, I guess, I don't know how, let me see here. Okay, well, this is Paris. It's, Paris allows, and France generally, but we argue that we call the ethos of non-pasteurized romance, which we distinguish from Hollywood-style romance. And we take that metaphor from the fact that you have these non-pasteurized cheeses, that people are willing to take health risks, which is, if you're too overly concerned with your health, it's too bourgeois, even jogging in Paris not viewed as a cool thing, And we use that metaphor to discuss this idea in some detail. Now, of course, for New York, we argue that, nothing surprising, I'm sure you all know this, that we argue that it's an ethos of ambition, which has been, why is it the city that is both the capital of capital, so to speak, and the capital of culture? And it's mainly because of the rich and diverse immigrants that have shaped New York, and rich and ambitious and optimistic, the ambitious and diverse immigrants that have shaped New York in so many beautiful ways. And here we have the Italian immigrants landing in Ellis Island in the early 20th century. This photo nicely expresses their sense of optimism. Okay, I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Blair. Well, good morning. It's an honor to be here with all of you at the Wilson Center and to take part in this conversation in celebration of Daniel's new book. There's so many ways in which I came away from my reading of this book inspired, challenged, and profoundly impressed with the creativity and originality of the work of Daniel and his co-author. The key insights that cities can have an ethos, a characteristic spirit, a way of life, that an ethos is always in the process of becoming, always a work in progress, constantly evolving and adapting, that we play a role in what this ethos is and what it is becoming, that there's a project, there's work, intentional work to be done in developing this characteristic spirit, and that cities, especially those with the strength that comes with an ethos, offer resources for responding to the globalization that defines this moment in history. These insights offer us a powerful framework in which to think about our participation in the civic life of our cities. In offering my reflections, I'd like to situate myself, give you a sense of the perspective out of which I'm offering these reflections, and then I want to pose 3 questions for all of us. I speak from the perspective of someone who's lived his life. This is my 38 years now that I've lived here in Washington at Georgetown University, a Catholic and Jesuit university in the District of Columbia. And we are inextricably linked to this city, a city that is in transition, evolving and adapting now in new ways. We are a global university, but firmly rooted in this local community. So let me elaborate briefly on these qualities that capture the position from which I offer these reflections. I think as many of you know, Georgetown was established in 1789 at the dawn of our new republic. We were founded in January. The Constitution was adopted in September. We like to think we're just a little bit ahead of the country. But at this time, negotiations were underway to carve out a suitable territory bridging Maryland and Virginia, which would serve as the capital of the United States, and the city was founded in 1791. Georgetown was founded 2 years earlier by a member of one of the great founding families of our nation, the Carrolls of Maryland. John Carroll, Georgetown's founder, was a Roman Catholic priest who later became the first bishop of the Catholic Church in the United States. His cousin Charles was a signatory to the Declaration of Independence. During his formative years, Carroll pursued some of his education in France, where he was influenced by the tradition of the Jesuits, a tradition that places great emphasis on locating their ministry in cities. Ours is a way of life embedded within the interaction between the city and the world. There's an old Latin saying that speaks to the 4 leaders within the Catholic tradition. The saying goes, Bernard loved the valleys and Benedict loved the hills, Francis the towns, Ignatius the great cities. Well, St. Ignatius, the founder of the Jesuits, imagined the work of the Jesuits to be out in the world. He did not imagine an order that would be in a monastery. And he found the city as the place in which his order could connect both with the currents of intellectual, political, and social life, while also living in solidarity with the poor whom they had pledged to serve. So we are inextricably connected to this city. This is a city in profound transition. My colleague Maurice Jackson is here today, a distinguished member of our faculty in the Department of History who spent the past year as a visiting scholar here at the Wilson Center. And he's written about DC's changing demographics, the transitions the city has undergone since 1957, when we became the first major city in the country with a majority African American population. The 2010 census revealed that our population has grown for the first time in 60 years, with a 5% increase in the number of people registered as living in the district. More than ever, young people are turning to the city as a place to make their lives. In the past 3 years, 7,000 people, in each of the past 3 years, 7,000 people between the ages of 25 and 34 have moved to the district and to the surrounding neighborhoods. African Americans no longer make up the majority of residents in the district, while the Hispanic population has grown by 21% over the last decade and now comprises 10% of our population. Today, we're faced with the challenge of honoring our past and the opportunity of building on it in order to ensure that our city provides a context where its diverse citizens can create lives of meaning and fulfillment. We each have a responsibility to contribute to the collective development of our community. And at Georgetown, we understand this responsibility is bound up in our history and our identity. The commitment emerges from a deeper understanding of our ties across cultures, faith, and races that is occurring in our increasingly globalized world, but it is a responsibility that is learned locally through the experiences that we share at home and within the communities in which we are formed, first in our families, then in our hometowns and villages, in our cities. These are the communities of origin, of our origin. These are communities that Charles Taylor defined as our defining communities. As universities, our primary aim is the development of young people, the formation of young people, and we have a responsibility to them for both the cultivation of their intellects and the forging of their characters, and our ability to contribute to the lives of our students relies on the experiences they bring with them and on those that they encounter when they're with us living in Washington, D.C. I think the distinguished philosopher Martha Nussbaum traces this recognition of the importance of the local back to the very first to explicate this moral insight. But there's a profound resonance to what I'm going to read from Martha, to the idea of graded love that Daniel described just a moment ago. Martha wrote, the Stoics stress that to be a citizen of the world, one does not need to give up local identifications, which can frequently be the source of great richness in life. The Stoics suggest that we think of ourselves not as devoid of local affiliations, but as surrounded by a series of concentric circles. The first one is drawn around the self, the next takes in one's immediate family, then follows the extended family, then in order, one's neighbors or local group, one's fellow city dwellers, one's fellow countrymen. And outside of all of these circles is the largest one, that of humanity as a whole. And our task as citizens of the world will be to draw the circles somehow toward the center. We begin in the local. We each have our own identities, and it's in these very identities we ask our students to bring into the orbit of our universities. And we need to embrace these identities in the communities that nurture and sustain them as we move out in these concentric circles, recognizing the importance of embracing the global, but never at the cost of these original identities. Now, as Daniel has identified in the book, there are two dynamics at work in our world that are inextricably linked: globalization and urbanization. Now, regarding the latter, let's consider the following. More than half of the world's population, 3.3 billion, live in cities. This figure is projected to grow to at least 60% by 2030. About 180,000 people move into cities across our globe each day. This phenomenon is particularly significant in developing nations where 60 million people move into cities each year, a rate that is expected to grow over the course of the next 30 years. In comparison, in 1800, only 2% of the world's population lived in cities. In 1950, 30%. And as I said, today we're at 50, moving to 60. As we look to the future, by 2015, there will be 23 cities across the globe with a population greater than 10 million. 19 of these will be in developing nations. And by 2025, China will have 221 cities with more than 1 million inhabitants, which is up from roughly 160 or so today. These statistics give you a little bit of a sense of the ways that urbanization is impacting our world on a global scale, and of the moral urgency to take seriously the issues that Daniel has shared with us. What do our cities need to be? What do they need to become in order for us to respond to these forces of urbanization and globalization? As I read the book, I couldn't help but ask, so what is the characteristic spirit of Washington, D.C.? We're not one of the 9 cities that Daniel and his co-author have strolled, seeking out the unique identity that differentiates, that distinguishes, that define each of the 9 cities. And I don't imagine it will be easy for us to answer this question. The city means so many things to so many people. For some, we might best be described as the nation's city. People from throughout the country come here to do the nation's work. Every 2 years, we elect 435 representatives from throughout the country. We stagger the election of senators, but every 2 years, a third go through the electoral process. Once elected, the members of Congress will bring staffs from their hometowns and communities, and soon they fully immerse themselves in both the work of our Congress and in the life of our city. Perhaps a better term would be we are the people's city. The work of the legislative body, but also 18 million people a year come from throughout the country to visit this city, enjoying the Smithsonian's and the monuments, all of the treasures of our city. Perhaps we might be best be referred to as a global city, usually in terms that run 3 years, but sometimes more. Ambassadors come from throughout the world, with more than 170 having official residences here in Washington. Add to that the international agencies that call Washington home, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and others. The cosmopolitan quality of Washington is a defining characteristic for many. I know the college presidents like to say we are the city where the number of students enrolled in our city's colleges and universities is the largest as a percentage of the population of any city in the United States. Take that, Boston. Now, we combine that with the highest level of educational attainment in the population of any city in America, and we like the idea that we are America's college town. And for others, for reasons that I've already identified, the meaning of this city is tied deeply to the history of race in America. This was the dividing line between the North and the South, a southern city in the mid-19th century, but the capital of the Union. You can look across the Potomac from the Lincoln Memorial and see the home of Robert E. Lee. As I mentioned, we are the first city with a majority black population. We're home to Frederick Douglass, Duke Ellington, Chuck Brown. For others, this is the characteristic spirit of Washington. So let me close with 3 questions. First, I'd like to challenge all of us to think hard about the characteristic spirit, the ethos of this city. If we don't yet meet the criteria that Daniel has established, perhaps we're best understood as a city still seeking the bonds that will unify us, bring us together, provide a framework for greater coherence and deeper identity. But second, and again for us here in this city, what is the work of strengthening our city such that we could find ourselves, perhaps in a future edition of Daniel's book, as having a legitimate claim to an ethos in the same way as the 9 cities that Daniel has described? How do we strengthen our ethos, particularly as we cope with all of the changes we now confront? An ethos is constructed by the decisions and actions, the choices and commitments, the countless everyday acts of our citizens. What are the actions that can contribute to the development of a characteristic spirit of the city of Washington? I can say from the perspective of the universities, we see ourselves as partners in this process of transformation. We believe we're an indispensable resource for our city as we manage a transition in demographics, and as we seize the opportunity to be perhaps the nation's greenest city and perhaps the next great technology sector in our nation. Finally, I'd like us to consider a third question. Is it possible in this global age for us to identify an element of the spirit that can connect all of our cities? I ask this in the context of thinking about our cities as the way Daniel has encouraged us, as resources for responding to the challenges of globalization. Remember, we're still coming to terms with a rapid globalization. There are 7 billion people in our world. The 6 billionth person is 13 years old. Half of the world is living on less than $2 a day, more than 1 billion in abject poverty, living on less than $1 a day. Daniel so appropriately sees our cities as uniquely capable of addressing some of the challenges that emerge through this globalization. But what if global challenges require global solutions that, given the interconnected nature of our world today, we can't resolve big challenges, climate change, water security, universal education, in a week in which we're hosting the World AIDS Summit, HIV/AIDS, without finding a way to bring our cities more closely together in spirit? Can we develop a dimension of our cities that recognizes that part of the ethos of every city is the need to come together to work to protect and care for all of our people? A city can be a source of inspiration and consolation. It can provide access to ideas and talents. A city can enable us to be bigger than ourselves, to see things, to learn things, to be things we never thought possible. We can be more alive. But a city can also be a source of fear, of isolation. We can pull up our bridges, lock our doors, duct tape our windows. Will we be able together, drawing from our distinctive strengths, to allow the city to become a new force, one that will ensure that as more find their ways in, more will become possible? Again, it's a privilege to have this opportunity to be with Daniel and the colleagues here. And thank you for listening.
Do you want to say anything?
I find it hard to disagree.
Okay.
I mean, why don't we open it up? For
Okay, we're going to open it up for discussion. We have about a half hour, and I'm going to actually ask the first question as I'm taking down. People are going to talk. When you were talking about the different Washingtons,
Yeah.
you talked about Washington as a college town, but there's one Washington you didn't mention, which also, I think, challenges you kind of cast off as well. Washington is a military town. And you think about the number of people in this town who are connected in one way or another to the military. And that leads me to your observation fairly early on that cities have a certain advantage for dealing with some of the challenges we face because they don't have armies. But armies are out there and nation states are out there. This begins to get to the question, I guess you ended on how can we resolve global problems at this local level? But also, how do we bring the nation state into this discussion? Maybe you could say a few words, Daniel?
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be a need for nations and states, and I do think there's a good case to be made for national identity as well, at least because it's important to have this sense of national identity in order to redistribute resources from the rich members of the national community to the poor. And there's a need to protect boundaries, and for that you need armies. I mean, it's kind of obvious, for example, in Chinese history when it was routinely bullied by foreign powers. Now it has more security, so it's less likely to be bullied by foreign powers, and it couldn't be that way if it didn't have, a substantial military. So obviously that's not a problem. But it's a problem when having a strong military can be put to misuses, for example, carrying out wars that are unjust according to some criteria. And I think having a strong, and how does that happen? Well, partly it happens because it's in countries that have a strong, very strong nationalism, it's easier for political leaders to draw on that nationalism to do immoral things. But I think if cities have a strong, distinctive character, which is different than a national character, it tends to provide a critical perspective on nationalism and allows for, and it raises questions regarding this kind of a more militaristic forms of nationalism, and maybe allows for a more softer, and kinder form of nationalism to become dominant. I'll just give you some examples. I mean, look at New York. They have such a strong sense of urban identity, and they also tend to be quite, critical regarding the potential misuses of military force in a way that if a city is homogenized and people don't have a strong sense of urban identity, where are they going to project that need for community? If it's projected mainly on the nation, I think that's that critical perspective on nation. It's easier for it to get lost. Now, for cities like Washington that are both, capitals and also distinctive cities, I mean, I guess it's easier for those things to be meshed.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to say anything?
Yeah, it's a terrific insight, and my mind's reeling now as a result. I spent the last 10 days in Palo Alto, just doing some work for Georgetown. And one of the great raps on us is why can't we be more like Stanford, being an engine of economic growth and innovation. And one reason why I spend time out there is trying to figure out, Steve Pearlstein of the Washington Post is about every year or so we'll do an essay in which he says, why can't we have something like Stanford? And it's not like we don't have feelings, But here's an interesting thing, and I think it's right at the heart of what you're saying. If you compare the regions, the Washington, D.C. metropolitan region and basically the Silicon Valley, we roughly do the same amount of R&D. There's roughly $25 billion of R&D in both the Silicon Valley and in this greater metropolitan area of Washington. They're number one in commercialization of the R&D that takes place in the region nationally, number one, and we're roughly 40th. So the difference isn't that we're not engaged in encouraging, but the kind of research that's done in this region has more of a resonance with the point that you make, that it is tremendous amounts are being sponsored by the Department of Defense in various forms. Then great research in different contexts, but its animating source is funding from the federal government, particularly the Department of Defense, and the flow of talent and ideas and intellectual property on the West Coast is just so different than it is here, and we're much more stovepiped and protected. It's a lot of the research that is sponsored by the Department of Defense is confidential research. So it helps. It helps explain some of the challenges we wrestle with, because we recognize this is an incredible place to be a university, but it doesn't lend itself to some of the same kind of economic implications that other institutions have an opportunity to benefit from.
Okay, I have first David Rusk. I have 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, we're going to collect some questions. First, we're going to come up here to make it easier for the person with a microphone, and then we're going to move back a little bit on this side, and then we'll come over here, and we'll collect 3 or 4 comments and see how far we get. But please keep your comments direct.
David Rusk, Building One America. Professor Bell, what is the population of the New York about which you write?
The population of New York about which I write?
Mm-hmm. The city that you write about.
Right. Should I answer now? Or?
Well, I think
Is it the 8.3 person 5-borough municipality? Is it the 21 million person greater region that focuses on New York politically, culturally, in sports terms? I mean, I'm really asking because I find an awful lot of literature, very scholarly literature, isn't very precise when they talk about city versus metropolitan areas versus conurbations. That's all.
Yeah.
why don't we collect some questions? I'll just comment as we pass the microphone over here that what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to make it easier. We'll collect around the room. I'm involved in a rethinking of the city of Moscow. And in the beginning, the very first thing that the Moscow city officials said is, we're not going to worry about borders. And they put up a satellite photograph at night. And they showed where the lights were. And they said, this is Moscow. And I think, so this is the question about central city, about political borders. Okay, we're going to go to Steve. Okay, you have the microphone. Go ahead.
Diamond Liu. Speaking as a former architect, architects do try to synthesize and crystallize, and at times even be able to redefine the identity of a city. So example is Eiffel, building the Eiffel Tower, and the picture that you showed earlier in Spain. But there is the difference between the expression of identity, which architects to grapple with, and the formulation and gestation of an identity. That involves many more communities and the leadership of a city's fathers. Certainly, the example of the Renaissance cities where the city fathers were able to shape not only the culture of the city, but the culture of country and even the civilization. Now, the second point, I would like you to make that distinction. I would like to hear that distinction of, formulation of identity and the expression of an identity. I think they are very different. The second point I would like to make is that I have problem with your, Professor Bell, your interpretation of Confucianism. Not just the gradation of love here, but in general, but means interpreting Confucianism is a cottage industry in China for thousands of years. So there's nothing new there. Now, the issue of gradation of love, there is no gradation. There is a capacity of love. The first one is that 修身齐家治国治天下, to discipline yourself, to take care of your family, and to extend that care to the community, to the state, to under heaven, is not defined by the intensity of lessening of your love, but defined by the capacity to love. And that begins with the disciplining of oneself.
Okay. We're right next to you.
The Italians have the word campanilismo, of primary loyalty to what you can see from your campanile, your church tower. And it's been said about the Greek politeia that Macedonia never would have conquered Greece but for the disunity of the respective city-states and people regarding themselves primarily as Thebans, Athenians, or Spartans rather than as Hellenes.
I think we'll take one more question on this side. Right there, yes. The gentleman in the peach-colored shirt. Then we'll give Daniel a chance to respond, and we'll go to this side of the room.
Great, thanks. My name is Brian McCabe. I'm a sociologist at Georgetown. I wanted to ask a question about your sort of choice of cities. So we have this tendency in sort of urban studies, right, to pick a set of cities and use them as paradigms for the way that cities operate. So Chicago and New York and London, and increasingly, right, Shanghai and Berlin. But does sort of the set of things that you're talking about, civic pride, does this apply to kind of a small set of cities or well-known cities, or are we seeing this phenomenon in the 160 other million-person Chinese cities and in the Clevelands and the Omahas and the sort of less-known American cities?
You have 5 big questions. We'll give you a chance.
Oh, I wrote 4, but...
Well, one person had 2. Well, but one might not have been a question. So.
Yeah, okay, well, let me begin in reverse order. What drove the choice of cities? I mean, I confess it's partly personal experience. My friend is from Jerusalem, I'm from Montreal. I live in Beijing, and it occurred to us that those are all strikingly different cities, and that seem to affirm a different set of social and political values, and people argue about different things typically. And and that they take pride in those sorts of in those sorts of differences. So partly it's personal experience, and we don't want to argue that every city has a strong ethos. It just so happens that the cities that we know well tend to have a relatively strong ethos, and that kind of drove the choice. But in the future, we're organizing other conferences, for example, with other Chinese cities, and we're asking people about those cities to write about their cities, and they also have a strong ethos. We didn't know very well, about Harbin or Changsha and so on. But having said that, I mean, we're not arguing that in a way, it's a normative thesis that it's good to have an ethos. So cities that don't have an ethos ought to strive to get one, so long as a basic material well-being is secured. And so there may be some cities that don't have a strong ethos, and we argue that maybe they ought to strive for one. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but it's political theorists, I confess, don't have as rigorous a methodology as sociologists, and I apologize for that. About the Italian word, it's true that there is that word in Italian to express a kind of strong urban-based identity or attachment to the clock or to the church tower, and that's pejorative in Italian. And actually, there's a similar word in French. So we didn't want to use those words. We wanted to find something that didn't have those pejorative words, because the word in Italian and in French too, it means that you're very parochial, close-minded, just attached to your narrow community. But we want to identify, it's partly driven by normative considerations. Cities that have a strong sense of cultural particularity, but that also have the openness and tolerance of the good side of globalization, so to speak. About the Confucianism and the graded love, I mean, of course, I agree, that famous passage from the Book of Great Learning, that it begins by disciplining yourself. But as I'm sure you know, there's also a lot in both Confucius and Mencius and in subsequent Confucian texts, texts that are part of the Confucian or that Ru tradition in Chinese, what happens if there's a conflict between our identities, What happens if, there's a conflict between the love of my father and the love of the national community, to use a modern terminology, and the Confucians tend to come down on the side that, well, you do your best to balance, but at the end of the day, the ones that are closest to you in terms of intimacy should have priority, and there's a famous passage in the Analects of Confucius that I'm sure you know. What happens if your father steals a sheep, and then Confucius, well, you should kind of cover up for him, and that's viewed as, that's negative, but there's a whole debate about what that means. But but at the end of the day, if there is a very serious conflict between, your family ties and your national ties, the family ties should have priority. So in that sense, it is a kind of graded love.
Well, we are beginning to run out of time,
Okay.
so.
Now about the population, about formulation of identity versus, I think it's a good point, an expression of identity. I need to think more about that. About the population of New York, what's the population? I mean, I guess to a certain extent, you could say it's just Manhattan, but it also, and it's not just New York. I mean, there's some cities that have a very strong ethos, and no matter where you are in the city, it's bound to affect the way that you interact, and you can't avoid it. Montreal is very clear in the case of language. Whether you're in the center of Montreal or in the suburbs, you can't avoid being entangled in the linguistic politics of the city. Jerusalem is very clear also in the case of religion. New York, you can argue, the ethos of ambition, which is driven by a very diverse set of immigrants. I think it does extend beyond Manhattan, and so the question is, to what extent what we describe as ethos affects people beyond, a certain area. I mean, I do think that it tends to have more impact than just in the center of the city. Beijing too, or think of Beijing, or even Shanghai. Shanghai has a very strong sense of its civic pride, and there they really do argue. I love Shanghai more than at China, it tends to and the new immigrants in Shanghai, after a while, often adopt this sort of identity in a way which is kind of peculiar from a Beijing perspective.
Okay, we only have about 10, 15 minutes left. I want to get this side of the room. We'll go first right there. And then I see there's another hand over here. Is there a third hand in this corner? Okay, we'll take these two and see where we are.
Hugh Schwartz. I'm author of a book on Curitiba, Brazil. In Brazil, two of the secondary cities are particular examples of the advantages and disadvantages of top-down versus participatory or bottom-up city governing. There are lessons to be learned from both. In your study, Daniel, of the 9 cities, did you find any examples of this, any lessons about top-down versus bottom-up governance?
Okay, and we have a very patient person over here.
I think this is related among Professor Bell. Among the 9 cities that you covered, did you try to do a little bit of work, distinguish the capital cities and the other cities? Because when we think about Washington, D.C. and New York, obviously there's a huge difference. One is a federal capital city, not just the military presence that's already mentioned, but also the political needs, economic needs, the budget for transportation, for urban planning, and everything else, the decision-making power, where it is. And if you compare Shanghai and Beijing, there's the same issues there.
Okay, we have a question over here, and then I think we'll begin to wrap up and give you the last word.
Thank you. My name is Bill Hudnut, and I teach at Georgetown. I happen to be the chairman of the Sister Cities Committee. It's a phrase you mentioned, out in Montgomery County, which is adjacent to D.C. And we ran into quite a buzzsaw when we started to establish a relationship with Bet Shemesh in Israel because of the violation of human rights over there, epitomized by the throwing of rocks at the little girl as she was going to school. And pretty soon it came down to this, that, and I agree with everything you said about the ethos of a city, but pretty soon it came down to this. Any city you go to, you can find violations of human rights. So how do you compute that into this ethos that you're talking about?
Why don't we take these 3 questions, and then I'll give President DeGioia a chance to offer some final observations and come back for final observations.
Okay, thank you. In terms of a violation of human rights, I think we begin with a very minimal view of human rights. It has to be systematic violation of really quite minimal human rights, bearing on the right to life, can be tortured, enslaved, and your basic material needs have to be met. But beyond that, so it has to be systematic. And I think my friend here, Avner, has a slightly different view than me. My own view is that it doesn't really matter whether the city is governed in a democratic way or in a other way. So long as the basic human rights are not met, are secured, then we should allow for differences in those cities to flourish, so to speak. And I don't have a huge problem with cities that are not governed in a more democratic way, which goes back to this kind of top-down versus bottom-up issue. There are different ways of creating an ethos, and obviously sometimes it has to be top-down. Like in the case of Singapore, it's quite clear. They were reluctantly thrown into nationhood. They wanted to be part of Malaysia, and then Malaysia said, "We don't want you." And Lee Kuan Yew famously cried when he was given his country to govern. And they really went with this great city planner called Goh Keng Swee, the number 2 in charge, to really had to create a sense of nation building. This was an extreme case of top-down planning, which really was meant to create a sense of national identity based on the city. But you can also have bottom-up, an ethos that emerges from more informal, organic, civil society interactions between people. I mean, it could emerge either way, but it doesn't really matter from our point of view, how it emerges, so long as the ethos is there, and that you have to try to understand historically how it got there, and how it's likely to proceed in the future, so to speak. But once it's there, then we think, so long as basic human rights are secure, then there's a good case to be made for promoting that ethos. About capital cities versus other cities, I agree that capital cities are more likely to have some sort of political ethos, and in the case of Beijing, we argue that it's a city of political power, but not just in the sense that it's an administrative capital and ambitious political leaders go there, but also in the sense that that's where social critics gather and artists who are politicized go. The politicized artists tend to go to Beijing, not to Shanghai, and mainly because I guess it's a capital city, and as well as the leading social critics tend to be based in Beijing. And the taxi drivers in Beijing are much more politicized than the ones in Shanghai, for example. So capital cities obviously will have an ethos or some sort of set of values that are strongly informed by political issues, national political issues, in a way that non-capital cities are not.
Professor Joy?
Sure. Well, thank you. It's just been a privilege to be a part of this. I think what I'd like to just leave with is a sense of just building from the three questions that I posed at the end of my remarks. There is a project before us. For those of us who live our lives here in the city of Washington, there is a project before us, and this is a city in transition. I made reference to my colleague Maurice Jackson's elegant essay that he wrote in mid-June describing some of the implications of the transition that we're going through. Just another anecdote, I was in a meeting with some city leaders a few months back, and one civic leader came in and was just exasperated. Took a little longer to get to where we were meeting, and just said, "We've got to get rid of these bike lanes." And another civic leader said, "Get used to the bike lanes. This is the new Seattle." And we're a city in transition. And what will this city be like as we evolve over the course of this next generation? And I think we're so fortunate that Daniel offers us some very rich resources in which to think about this project. It is a political, social, economic project, but it's also fundamentally a moral project. And I don't think we could have been given a better gift as a city than to have the reflections that Daniel and his co-author provide us in the spirit of the cities. So thank you.
Daniel, any final thoughts?
Well, I just thank you so much for those very thoughtful comments, and hope maybe we can establish sister cities between Washington, Beijing, and Montreal. I don't know.
Well, I want to thank everyone. I want to go back to a point that Daniel made about what is the ethos of a city. It's what perhaps people argue about. And I think one of the really wonderful aspects of this book, and I think it does go back to that idiosyncratic nature of Montreal. This is a book you can argue with, and I think we had some glimpses of that here. And it's a book that's worth arguing with. There are some books that one can argue with that just aren't worth it. This is really worth it. And I think it will cause you to think differently about the project of where the world is going in a world in which most people live in cities. It is available outside. I think you might even get a signature if you purchase it. But I want to bring this down to the local. And you mentioned Maurice Jackson's essay in the Chronicle of Higher Education on the fate of Chocolate City. I recommend the essay, but I also recommend the responses to the essay, some of which, quite frankly, were shocking. And I think what Maurice and his interlocutors have provided is a window on just how difficult a project we all have to engage in here in Washington as the city changes. So I want to thank Daniel for thinking large, and I want to thank Professor DeJoy for bringing us down to the local. That's really what this book is about, and I hope you'll purchase a copy and get a signature on your way out. Thank you all very much.